welcome to our Fireside Chat. Our guest this evening is Chris Sosa. And Chris's background spans journalism, education, and advocacy. In fact, he served as a New York State Senate aide. He was a member of the team that created the DREAM Act, and he worked for one of the first Senate district offices that provided legal services to tenants. He also covered the Bill Cosby case as a journalist, so I'm particularly interested in that issue. He also worked for a nonprofit that helped immigrants and refugees pursue a college education. So for someone so young, you've certainly done quite a lot, Chris. So so welcome, certainly.
Thank you.
And real quickly, just wanted to cover some missing elements there. Can you tell us what senator you worked for?
Of course. I worked for Senator Jose Peralta when he was not in the IDC, because I was employed with the Democratic caucus. I also worked for Senator Sepulveda during his inauguration. There was a lot of cross-communication between my role and other Senate offices because we were working in conjunction, as a caucus to pass legislation, because it was the first time in 11 years that the Democrats had control of the chamber. So there was a lot of work to get done.
Very nice. And what actually got you involved in politics?
That's a great question. I actually planned to become a film director when I was a kid. I feel like a lot of little kids, they either want to become astronauts or filmmakers or firemen. And for me, it was I wanted to make movies. I wanted to be the next Steven Spielberg. But as I started my studies in college, I was deeply interested in the social problems that were facing the world. And I started shifting more towards documentary filmmaking studies. And through that, I started to realize that to really have a voice in filmmaking, you needed to have money. You need to have studios behind you. And a lot of the times, that funding doesn't come if the issue is controversial or is something that's not yet garnering public attention. And I was working as a freelance journalist at the time, and my readership was continuing to go up and up. So I realized towards the end of my college studies, the way that I probably could best serve my community was as a journalist. So I started work full-time as a journalist right after I graduated from Northeastern University. I worked for an LGBT-centered publication headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. And from there, I had bylines in publications like Huffington Post, Salon, Yahoo News. I actually lost track of the number because I was syndicated. So, when you're syndicated, you write for one publication and then you go out into a whole ecosystem. So newspapers were printing my stories. I don't even know who they were. But I really enjoyed the work. And as I was covering these stories, I always wanted to have more of an impact on the outcome. Because as a journalist, you're recording what's wrong and you're trying to shed light on issues. But I'm a very hands-on and proactive kind of person. So I decided I had always known that eventually I would run for office. I think probably in my early 40s. I'm clearly not in my early 40s because the Trump administration sped me up a little bit. I realized that I was dissatisfied with the leadership that I was seeing around the state. And I knew that one of the best leaders in our city, who's Ben Kalos, was going to be leaving the seat due to term limits. So I sat down with Ben and I told him my plans to run for office. We had a fantastic conversation, and I felt ready because of the work I'd done in the Senate and how successful our office had been. I wanted to bring that leadership here. And I feel like when it comes to issues of moral integrity, good governance, et cetera, Ben's been a real leader in that front. So I want to build on that work and think that I'm the best person in the race to do it, just given my background.
Excellent. Well, in terms of journalism, do you know where some of your work on Bill Cosby was published?
Yes, but not all of it is public. So I was working with an organization called Care 2. This is an organization that oftentimes works behind the scenes with survivors to get their stories heard and build media campaigns around it. So not only did I document sexual assault firsthand from the survivor community, I also was underpinning the campaign efforts at the time because we would provide field staff. So a lot of the boycotts that you were seeing that led to that public reckoning, that was through my organization. So the organization is called Care 2, but most people don't know the name of the organization because we always keep the focus on the people. Mm-hmm. And my initial reporting ended up being corroborated by the New York Times as well, because there were elements of the survivor stories that I didn't publish, because obviously you have to balance the public interest with the privacy of the people that are telling you their stories, and especially when dealing with something so sensitive like sexual assault, you want to ensure that you're not exploiting people that have been through trauma, for more attention or clicks. So it was a very fine line. I hope I did a good job, but I can say with pride that our campaigns worked, because there was a reckoning. And as venues stopped booking Bill Cosby and we started seeing more interest from prosecutors, we finally wound up getting him for crimes that frankly had been discoverable for many years, since
Yes.
before I was a journalist.
Yeah. Well, you may be interested in knowing that I've been working with legislators really around the country in order to define consent in our laws. And about 3 weeks ago, Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright did something really transformational and submitted the bill that we had suggested in the Assembly. And it will be the very, very first law, if it passes, when it passes, to actually define the word consent in penal code. And
it's so incredibly important, and that's really cool that you worked on it, and especially because, as you just said, consent is not defined in laws, but most people don't realize that even just what we would consider to be outright crimes, such as rape within marriages, were essentially not illegal
Exactly.
until shortly before I was born. I mean, it's simply awful. And a lot of people, even though culture has moved forward pretty quickly over the past few years, our laws still have a lot of ways to go to catch up. So that's thank you for that work. That's really
so
important.
This is going to be, I think, a major transformation, and we'd love to see it get done, and hope we get your support in order to get that done.
You already have it.
I love it. Okay. So now, can you tell us a little bit more about your platform, and what are the 3 most important things to you, and what is it that you plan to do about them?
Sure. As I said towards the beginning, I believe that the primary crisis that we face is a lack of moral courage. Oftentimes politicians overcomplicate problems or talk about how daunting tasks are because they don't actually want to take a proactive role in fixing them, because they're afraid of the political fallout or the people that they're going to upset in that process. And throughout the last year of a pandemic that essentially brought us to a grinding halt, there have been 3 issues that have been at the forefront, which I would consider to be housing justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And these things are linked to each other. They affect everything from transportation to education policy to rebuilding seawalls. And I want to see our recovery be something. I know Joe Biden often uses the phrase "build back better." And it's a little bit of an awkward phrase, but I like the concept that we can create something that we weren't able to create before because we're having to start from a different place. And I believe we're not going to get this opportunity again for a really long time. So it's important that we're electing people that are willing to take those risks and fight for their communities to actually get the job done. And especially, as you know, living on Roosevelt Island, because there aren't as many voters on Roosevelt Island, Roosevelt Island often gets overlooked because politicians frequently decide what fights they take on based on how much political capital it gains them, not based on what's right or what's wrong. And I hope that's something that you're going to see different from me than many other candidates throughout the city, is that I fight for what I believe to be right, whether or not that fight necessarily results in an increase in political capital.
Very wonderful. Carolyn Maloney pointed out to me the other day that the point that you just made, and that is, we need to beef up the registration here in this community. Because registered voters, are really something that candidates look at in order to determine, where they're going to invest their time and energy. And so it's so important. It's one of the reasons that Ellen and I are holding our fireside chats. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch to my buddy, Ellen. There you go, Ellen.
There we go.
Oh, I love the candles. That was cool.
Well, it's a fireside chat. We don't have fireplaces here, so we got to do something.
That's amazing.
All right, so hang on. I don't want to start a fire, so I'll blow it out. So, Chris, I just spent 2 hours with you at the debate, and it was great to hear everybody. We have such a pool of candidates. It's amazing. They're great.
Ellen, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I know Marty's going to have to leave in a second. So let's get to the issue that real quickly that Marty would want to hear about in the Upper East Side.
Yeah, so that's what I'm about to answer.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Right. So I understand, Marty, that you live right near this, the blood center. So, it's probably an issue that's near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
The blood center. So I want to ask you a question of Chris and of both of you, because coming from not really understanding the issue so much, I just want to really understand the issue. It looks like, okay, you're going to put a big building up in the middle of the block, but it's one big building and nobody looks up when they're walking. So, okay, so from rush hour, you're going to have people walking into the building. And then maybe at lunch hour, they'll come out of the building. And, the blood center does good things for the community. So why not let them get this tower, this commercial tower on top of their building? So can you lay out some of the reasons why the community is so against this? And why you personally are so against this?
I'm going to try not to give you an extremely lengthy answer. So I'm going to divide it into a couple of bite-sized parts. Number one is the environmental review process. If that tower were to be constructed where it's currently proposed, we would see an immediate degradation of the environment, including an impact on a local park and a local school. In addition to that, the construction would take 50 months, 50. So you would be dealing with extreme construction for years, which would have a negative impact on local housing. In addition to that, I agree, people usually don't look up when they're walking, so that might seem a little bit silly that people are making a big deal about the height of the building. But the issue with buildings of that height in areas that are zoned for residential is they cast permanent shadows because of the the direction of the earth and the sun. So you end up having sections of green space that are not receiving sunlight. So in addition to that, you're taking away space from family park space because these areas become industrialized. So those are just a few of the reasons on that side. On the other side, there's a real estate problem, which is that this would require us to rezone on the mid-block. And that kind of rezoning has actually, it would break precedent. We have not engaged in that type of rezoning since the early 1980s. It was part of an informal agreement that we wouldn't do that. Because once you violate that precedent, you can start doing it other places and essentially override housing. And the workaround here is that the Blood Center is a nonprofit, and the Blood Center is a great organization. So this isn't an issue with the Blood Center as an organization. They're a good organization, but this tower would largely be leased to commercial space. So we would essentially be breaking a precedent that keeps people's homes, their quality of life solid. We would be violating what the environmental review already shows as a pretty disastrous impact. And in addition to that, we would be opening the floodgates to real estate interests that would quickly encroach on housing around the area. So my issue isn't with the Blood Center as an organization. I think if they have that type of building needs, there are other places to do that sort of construction. The other thing is for anybody who wants to lead a community, we of course have to listen to the input of our community, and it's an 80-20 split right now. 80% of people who have submitted testimony have been completely against the project. So I also want to make sure that I'm representing the community's voices, the people who live there who are saying, this is going to negatively impact my life and I'm not comfortable with this project. So those are my primary reasons. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yep, it does. I mean, the one thing about setting a precedent, I'm not sure that that's true because, that's why we have the ULURP process. And that's
a very broken ULURP process.
Yes, we do.
I would agree if it worked.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Ellen, I'm
Yes.
not running for office, but if I could respond, because that's a very good point.
Go for it, Marty.
It's the variance they're looking for. There are a couple of other things Chris didn't mention. The variance they're looking for isn't a 10 or 20% variance. This area is zoned for 75 feet. They're looking for something that's over 400% higher. 335, where if you were talking about being on Community Board 8, they're trying to get a 220-foot limit along the avenues. This would be more, this is 50% higher in the middle of the block. All you really have to do to know why, and actually, Chris, you probably didn't hear the meeting last night, it was 100%. There were dozens and dozens of speakers unanimous against the tower. And it would, all you have to do is hear the testimony of the principals from Julia Richmond across the street. It will make you, it'll bring tears to your eyes. That school is in sunlight the entire day now. If this tower went up, it would be in shadow perpetually. That school has 6 different schools. It's not one school. It's the Julia Richmond Educational Complex. There's students from 3 months to seniors in high school, including one school for children on the spectrum, who the teacher said now there's a wait sometimes because they have to be brought right to the school in the bus. That street where they're proposing the tower, mid-block, is probably the busiest street in the Upper East Side, because it not only has this big educational complex, it is also a crosstown bus route. And it's not just a few people coming midday. It's 2,600 employees every day to a mid-block location. And also what it really is, and you got to break it down, it's the blood center and then this Boston developer. And if you read the fine print of what the application is, the blood center could build a building that they admit would meet all their needs within the zoning. So they're really selling the air rights that they don't own to this Boston developer to build a life science hub. And the city is looking to life science to bring jobs to the city. There are 7 or 8 life science buildings within the city going up, but they're all in commercial areas along avenues, none in the middle of the block. So the blood center is looking to get a free building by letting this Boston developer build a commercial for-profit building above their site. In fact, in the city filings, the blood center says they could build a new building on this site with 220,000 square feet. If this tower, this 33-story tower goes up, they will only take 200,000 square feet. So they don't even need as much as they could build within 75 feet. So that's part of it. It's what it will do with traffic is, there's a 2,600 employee, they call it 16 stories. It's 16 floors. It's 334 feet, which is taller than the 33-story building across 2nd Avenue from it, because they have buildings with high ceilings. It's also, as Chris correctly said, won't be ready for 50 months. And the New York Times had an article in October saying this life science boom is really a boomlet. And if they get this approval, then in 50 months, we don't know what the market will be. They could put luxury condos in there. In fact, the developer in a webinar said, life science space is also perfect for luxury condos.
Sounds like a Cornell on the Upper East, the same issues that we had in the Euler process in Cornell.
I tried to give a truncated version, but Marty said all the parts I didn't say. So I appreciate that.
Thanks for educating us, Marty.
All right.
It's all intertwined. So can you give us a nutshell version to begin with of how the intersection of housing, racial, and economic justice?
And how are you going to cure these problems?
Well, to start, I'm not going to cure these problems. With the help of the community and a wide coalition, we're going to cure them together, because no one is an island unto themselves. That being said, I think that a lot of the issue that we've seen with our current legislative agendas is that we treat problems in vacuums. We have this problem, we have that problem. If we solve these pieces of it, everything is fine. But oftentimes we're failing to see the larger picture. And the larger picture is that we have a completely segregated school system in New York City. And in fact, the level of segregation is comparable to what we saw prior to the civil rights movement, which is, a huge red flag. When we look at that, we should say something's clearly wrong systemically if our kids are being segregated in this way in the most diverse city in the entire world. In addition to that, we have seen wages going down, housing prices going up, and a complete disparity in general economic health of families. So we've seen the middle class being pushed downward to the point where we have a very large working poor class, and then we've seen the wealthiest people become wealthier. At the same time, the interests that are causing that to happen are pushing out affordable housing. Oftentimes, it's not as explicit as just getting rid of affordable housing. It's essentially having people buy up housing that they don't actually live in. So on the Upper East Side, there are so many units that are not occupied at all. They are purchased and then left and then untaxed. And when you're not taxing, what you're doing is you're incentivizing the hoarding of housing. And when housing is hoarded, that does nothing for actual New Yorkers who live here except raise the housing prices and make it harder for people to access affordable housing. So you see all these things happening at the same time, and they came into particularly clear focus when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, because people who were able just left the city. And so we were left with the people who were struggling the most and who were also at most risk of getting sick, which is people of color, seniors, and people who aren't economically stable. And when you have a system like that, and we're seeing these symptoms, and we're seeing people over 60 dying at rates that are simply horrifying, and we have a governor that seems more interested in burnishing his own perception than in letting us have the real data and see what's going on, um, we're never going to solve the problem. So until we start viewing every person as having value and building our policies around people rather than just economic development, we're going to keep having a city where the economy grows bigger and bigger and bigger, but the livability of the city goes further and further down and the inequalities get deeper. And that's what I'm hoping to, of course, not solve single-handedly, but to work on with a coalition of candidates. And I've already started building those relationships with people that are running, because we're going to have 35 new members of the council. It's going to be a lot of very new people. But I've also started building that coalition with people that are already on the council, because I think it's important that we bring in that expertise from people who have already had the job, both outgoing and people who are remaining. So I've sat down at length with Councilmember Kalos to go over a lot of these issues in more depth. I'm endorsed by Councilmember Menchaca, who does a lot of work around housing equity. I sat down with Councilmember Powers just the other day for coffee to just go over some of the legislative priorities and say, what can you tell me as I walk into this job to ensure that I'm ready on day one to work with you to get this done? Because when you have this many new people coming in at the same time, if you don't have the humility to listen to the people that are already there, you're going to have a set of freshmen that have one set of ideas, a set of people who are there who already have a set agenda, and both people are going to enter friction with each other. And I really want to see us working as a cohesive unit, because the problems are going to compound. This is going to be a tough economic recovery, and we need people that are coming not just with new ideas, but that are able to listen to people that have that institutional wisdom from already doing the job.
Well said.
Right.
Thank you.
So you said the schools are already segregated. So let's start.
Yes.
Let's start there. They're segregated because of the neighborhoods are segregated. Is that why?
No, actually, there's a couple of reasons, and it's a bit complicated. But as somebody who's going to be a foster parent within the next year or so, I was surprised to learn, when going through general entrance processes for schools, finding out what those processes were when evaluating schools, that depending on what borough you live in, your availability of schools is completely different. So I've lived in Queens in the past. If you live in Queens, you're locked by a district to a certain school. It's assigned to you, and that is the public school that you're going to go to. Whereas if you live in Manhattan, you can actually apply to any school in Manhattan. So it's a different set of rules depending on where you live. In addition to that, we engage in admissions practices that filter out students of color. We rely on certain types of standardized testing that is shown to widely favor white students. And part of the reason for that is that some students are receiving preparatory education for these standardized tests, and others are receiving none. So it actually isn't reflecting the student's academic ability. It's reflecting who got the answers first. Mm-hmm. So when you have that kind of system, you end up self-selecting the students that you want in your schools, which is how you end up in a situation like, let's take Eleanor Roosevelt High School, for example, one of the best high schools in the city. The number of Black applicants versus the number of Black kids admitted to the school, it's widely disparate. And it isn't based on the actual ability of students to perform. It's based on all these outdated systems we have of evaluating students. And I probably come at this from a slightly different perspective than a lot of people, because I was homeschooled until college. I grew up in an environment where the schools were very poor. And if I had gone through the public education system in Virginia, in the rural part where I grew up, I probably would not be here sitting with you right now. And the reason is because of this inequity in funding and the way that we treat students based on their socioeconomic status and their race. So when I look at the problem, I say, what are the barriers that we have for students who want to be academically successful and are not being given the tools? And when we look at it, it's because we have pipelines. There's pipelines for students to get them on track to an Ivy League college, there are other pipelines that head straight to prison. And until we address the fact that all of our kids are not being treated the same way, we're going to keep having those pipelines, and it's going to further divide our communities into rich, poor, black, white. And in my view, that kind of destroys the basic premise of what New York City is. New York City is widely viewed across the world is a place of hope where anybody who wants to work hard can go and succeed. And we're an unusually welcoming city. I know that was something that drew me to this city. I've known I wanted to be a New Yorker since I was a teenager, because there's no other place in the entire world where no matter where you're from, you can find a place and fully become a part of the community without giving up the identity that you had, because we don't force everyone to just assimilate and become the same. We allow for this diversity of experience, and we use it to make us culturally richer and create better relationships between our neighbors. So I think that we need to take those values that really encompass what our city is and apply that to the education system. And the main reason that hasn't happened, in my view, is most people don't realize it's happening, because these processes happen in the background. People assume that's just the way it is. You take a test, you get placed, et cetera. A lot of people don't realize the differences in funding and the differences that we see around student preparedness and the difference in discipline. The way that kids are disciplined is widely different based on their race. When we do studies of school discipline, we find that Black kids and white kids can engage in the exact same behavior, but Black kids will be ranked as violent in their behavior. Even when we're talking about grade school kids, something really simple, like, just walking up to a little kid and shoving them, which honestly, anybody who's worked with children knows that once in a while, if you're dealing with 3 and 4-year-olds, somebody's going to get pushed. But what happens when that occurs is oftentimes, depending on your race, you're either going to face discipline or you're going to face, instruction. And what we need to see is, our classrooms that are helping our kids grow into well-rounded people, not punishing them for various behaviors at different rates, and frankly, creating tier systems among our kids. Like, all of our kids should be living, playing, and working together. That leads to success.
Okay, so can you explain that a little bit more and how you would fix this education system to make it more equitable?
First, we can change the way that we're distributing our funding. The New York City budget has a lot of leeway in the way that we're organizing the funding. And one thing we can do is more equitably distribute those funds, basing it on things like property and wealth taxes. So we get a better idea of which communities need the most funding and which communities are already supported by funding. Because oftentimes what we have are schools that are receiving funding that don't actually need the funding because they've already received various grants, donations, and so forth. In addition to that, the way that we treat teachers is a big part of the problem. Teachers are paid very, very little. Oftentimes the classroom supplies are coming from out of pocket. And when you have a system like that, the ability of teachers to garner good materials is based on their personal wealth. So some kids are operating with completely different sets of materials than other kids. So on a very basic level, the quality of the materials kids are receiving is not the same. Another thing that we can do is end the standardized high admission testing, because we know that it doesn't work. It's creating like I said before, it's creating a pipeline where certain kids are predestined to go to some schools and other kids are predestined to go to others, and their actual academic performance is not what's being measured. So eliminating that, because we don't actually need it, it's just antiquated, would automatically result in a more integrated school structure. In addition to that, we need to change various state laws as well. And that requires a coalition between the council and the state legislature. And that's something that I'm uniquely suited to do because I've worked in the state legislature. I have working relationships with state senators that work on education. So we're able to create that, that bicameral system where we're adjusting the budgetary issues on the city side, but we're affecting the education laws on the state side. In addition to that, policing is a big part of it. Our kids are being policed when what they should be receiving is social services. So I would love to see police in schools replaced by social workers. A lot of times a kid's academic success is often linked to their home environments, and kids in poorer areas often have significantly less stable home environments. And something that we can't change their home, but what we can do is provide them better support in schools for dealing with the traumas that they're experiencing at home and the lack of stability. So that's where social workers come in. We need to expand mental health and social services at the school level because that's the only place a lot of kids are going to receive it. In addition, we need to make sure that our kids are not facing hunger. A number of kids face hunger in their homes. And something that we can do, and this is something that Ben Kalos has really advocated for, is ensure that every child going to public school is receiving free meals throughout the entire day. No kid should be hungry. We have the money to pay for that. It's not as expensive as people would have others believe. We can reallocate those funds. In addition to that, I think that we need to take a deeper look at the size of our schools. A lot of our schools simply have too many people per classroom, and kids are not receiving the individualized attention that they need. And one solution to that is, frankly, building more schools. We need more schools in this city. The population is growing, and schools are not growing at the pace necessary to ensure that all of our kids are getting a high quality education. And I say that as somebody who, as a homeschooler, I received one-on-one education all day long. And that has a really significant impact on a kid's learning, because kids have very different styles of learning. And when we put them all through the exact same education in a very pro forma way, and we're not giving them specialized attention, we're not able to identify what the gaps in their styles are or where they're specifically struggling. And those things compound on each other. So we end up having kids graduating high school that are functionally illiterate because they were simply never taught basic reading and critical skills at the level they should have been really early on, and they were just pushed through the system. So until we reduce the size of classrooms, we're going to keep having those kids who fall through the cracks. And as a future foster parent and a caregiver to a 20-year-old who has struggled with cognitive issues, in my family, who has received some of that specialized attention through the CUNY system, I want to see that same quality of service available to our kids in K through 12.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Now, Chris, I know if you've touched upon it. I think this is quite incredible. You're very young and you're single, and you're becoming a foster parent.
I am.
You already have mentored and housed a 20-year-old and put this person through school, put the person through college. What else have you done? What have you done for this person? And and what made you do this?
That's a really great question. So I guess I'll tell you the personal story. In college, I had a lot of roommates, and one of them I became very close to, and we stayed close for many years after college. And she married into a family, and we found out that her sister-in-law was abusing her children. So I reported it to my college roommate, and unfortunately, she didn't take action. So I did. I was in touch with the oldest, who was about to graduate high school. He contacted me and said, all of us are being abused at home. We need out. I don't know what to do. So I said, every school counselor is a mandatory reporter under law, and he was in Massachusetts. So I said, all you need to do, I was like, you're going to go to the counselor and you're going to say these words in this order. So I got the kids out of the house within about probably 4 or 5 hours. And none of them returned, which I'm very happy about. It was a court battle, but we won. And in addition to that, so all these kids were put into foster care, but the oldest, he was about to age out of that system. He wasn't a kid. This was, a rising college student. So he asked if he could stay with my family for the summer. Me and my cousin both live here. And I was already planning to foster or adopt through the New York Foundling. I'd already, completed a home inspection. I'd gone through orientation, so I was ready to go. So I had an extra room already. And I said, you know what? I'll push off activating my foster license for 3 or 4 months so you can come stay with us until you move on campus. He was accepted into Temple University. And once he got here, it became clear that he was a danger to himself. He hadn't received the care that he needed. There were issues around possible bipolar disorder, suicidal ideation, PTSD, just a lot of really severe stuff. So, when it became clear that it would have been unsafe and irresponsible to send him to an on-campus setting and just hope for the best, we offered to allow him to live with us full time. So we notified the Department of Children and Families of the plan to make sure everybody was on board, because you always want to make sure social workers are in constant contact and approving of when there's a change in a permanency plan. So they thought it was a very good idea. So we said, you can stay here with us. This can be your room. When I start fostering, I'll just get a place with another room. He decided to go to court and he wanted to join my family full time. My parents are very lovely people. And he said, he didn't really have parent figures in his life. He has some relationship with his biological father a bit, but it wasn't the person who raised him. So, he basically said, he started calling my mom and my dad and just came into the family. And he said, I want to change my name. And he said he wanted to have our family's last name. So we went through the court process. He's not an honorary Sosa anymore. He is a legal Sosa. So he joined our family. We enrolled him in community college. That way he would be able to do it at his own pace while receiving the mental health services he needed. We also utilize, I'm sure you're familiar with it, YAI, which is a really great organization that works with kids who are struggling with intellectual or cognitive disabilities. And through that process, he became the president of his pre-law society at BMCC. He was really excelling. He was on the dean's list. He got accepted into NYU, and he's studying at NYU now. And he's about 15 feet away from me over there with my cousin. And we love him very much. We're glad he's part of the family. And now that he's in a more secure place, I'm able to get back to the original plan, which was to bring a kid in. So my plan is to welcome foster kids. And usually what happens is you foster, any number of children. And as their permanency plan becomes apparent, they either go back to their parent, if the issues are resolved, or they need another permanency plan. So my plan is to foster until we reach a kid whose permanency plan falls through. And when that permanency plan falls through, I will legally adopt them. So that's the plan, and I plan to do that early next year after inauguration, because obviously trying to do that in the midst of a whirlwind campaign would be a little bit much.
So you have the personal experience that I was about to ask you. What makes you think that you can do this job? But now you're telling us that you've had like all this personal experience of going through the school system, the foster care system, the social services system, the mental health systems. You understand.
There is almost no part of government service that has not interacted with my life at some point. And I've served on teams that passed laws. And I think that that's, unique in this race. Not that, others are incapable. There's a lot of good people in my race. But, I was on the team. I was actually on 2 teams that passed law. I was on the senator's team who initially wrote the law, and he died suddenly. The legislation was passed to another senator, and I was actually invited to come to that senator's office and work with him as the law was passed. So that was how that transfer happened. And we passed a lot of good legislation. So I think it's, there's a level of institutional knowledge that you bring when you've worked in the legislature. But like we've also pointed out, personal life experience counts for something too. And I've taken on quite a bit, and I've not yet cracked under the stress. So I think I actually find it a lot of fun. I find politics a lot of fun, very fulfilling, because, knowing when I go to sleep at night that I help pass a law that gets thousands and thousands of kids into college every year now who wouldn't have otherwise had a path. I mean, that's just a deeply fulfilling thing to know I got to be a part of.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. Can I ask a few Roosevelt Island questions?
Yeah, let's
ask me
do
anything you want.
Okay. What do you see as the needs of Roosevelt Island?
Well, that's a great question. I also am going to eventually turn it around, because you live on Roosevelt Island. So I want to hear about the needs from the actual community, but needs that have already been brought up to me. There's a few. One, the banking situation. There has not been a permanent bank on Roosevelt Island, and one recently closed. And that's simply, it's terrible that we're relying on, at most one, serious banking provider. So I support public banking. I think we need to incentivize other banks to come to the island, but a lot of the, the folks on Roosevelt Island, not all of them are able to be traveling back and forth, or should they have to, from the mainland to do basic functions like banking. Another one is voting. Voting is harder for folks on Roosevelt Island than where I live. When it comes to early voting sites designations, I know there's been a slight improvement in that situation lately, but early voting, mail-in voting, and on-site voting should be the same for every New Yorker. You shouldn't be penalized because you live on a small island. Also, green space. As you know, there's over 300 trees that were just essentially demolished because REOC decided that this was all necessary to stabilize the seawall. There's a lot of ways to rebuild a seawall, and some of the environmental, impact studies that were done were not properly characterized. And a lot of the community said, this level of forest clearing is not what we want to see through the process. So, when you have an unelected corporation that's essentially running an island full of New York City residents, and those residents don't really have a lot of a voice in the process, you end up in a situation where there's a constant risk of overdevelopment, of unaffordable housing, of reduced social services. So I really think that a major concern that I've heard over and over and over from residents on the island is the problems with REOC and the relationship there.
Do you have any sense of how you would alter that?
Honestly, a lot of it is a state issue, so it requires a much deeper connection with state legislation, legislators, because on a city council level, as we're dealing with the state agencies, and you've probably noticed that oftentimes there's a lack of a solid working relationship between members in various chambers, and I think that happens for two reasons. One reason is that people are busy, and a lot of times they don't prioritize making those relationships because, again, it comes back to political capital. Sometimes you're not really going to get much out of it personally; it's just extra work. And another issue is that something I was surprised to find when working in the New York State Senate was how much personal pettiness played into all of it. There are so many factions and cliques, and these are grown people that are just not doing their jobs because they don't want to work with each other because of grievances that go back years, and that frankly, we're elected to do jobs. It doesn't matter if we were offended by another legislator or we don't like them for whatever reason. It's our job to do the work because our constituents rely on us. So I really I believe something that I would be good at is reducing that level of factionalism, because I've worked in a lot of very highly charged environments. And one thing that you'll hear from anybody who's worked with me, including past chiefs of staff, is that I tend to be a unifying presence in officers because I am not hot-tempered. I work hard, and I usually try to to build bridges and create coalitions and ensure that we're not allowing our own egos to get in the way of actually doing the work on behalf of the people that sent us there to do a job.
Excellent.
Okay, so I have a little bit of an issue with the trees that were cut down, that were allegedly cut down because they weren't 300 trees.
Right.
And there was an actual need, there was an actual need to take care of that section. And it could conceivably be very nice. It will probably be very nice when that seawall is done.
Reality is that
it was a misrepresentation.
you hit the nail on the head when it came to what you said about the fact that REOC is an appointed body, not an elected body. And unfortunately, we don't have enough transparency in how they run things. And regardless of how many trees were cut down, the community should have had more input in what was more knowledge. They should have been more vocal. REOC should have been more vocal in what their plans were and included the community more. And then you wouldn't have had the kind of derisive, back and forth over how many trees there were. And at the last,
I was going to say this very dynamic, where we have different numbers of trees. Like if we simply had more transparent data from REOC in the first place, these kinds of arguments don't happen. And that's a huge, like what Joyce just said is so important. And it goes back to what Ellen was saying, that, when you don't have a certain degree of government transparency, it ends up having a corrosive effect on the relationships of neighbors with each other, because they end up fighting these things out because the elected or the unelected body isn't doing the work. Exactly. And that's, I was talking at a forum, a community forum recently about that, because there were arguments around public safety and, what the best way was to address it. And I said, even if we have different solutions, the only reason that we're having to fight about this at all is because there were a bunch of people in power for years who didn't solve the problem. So it leaves it to us to fight it out. And that's, that's not a good situation. That doesn't do anything to build relationships between neighbors when people don't do their jobs, and we end up having, all this community tension.
The bike ramp. So RERA had one meeting, and REOC had another meeting, and Community Board 8 had another meeting, and maybe one person from each were at the other meetings, but they were not working together. So 3 different organizations had 3 separate presentations about the same project, and they didn't talk to each other.
Yeah, they're in silos.
That must lead to very frustrating conversations with you. I can imagine you all sitting at the dinner table going, "Oh my gosh, can everyone get on the same page here?"
Right. And then, and each meeting happened like within days of the other one, so they could have had a unified meeting that brought the whole entire community together and publicized it together and let everybody have their say.
There really needs to be more town halls where REOC is required to listen and respond, and other agencies such as Community Board 8 Their presence is also a requirement. And the community's presence, I think if they actually enable us to have a dialogue rather than simply listening to a meeting between them, then I think that you're going to get more transparency and more community involvement.
I just had one thing.
You can.
As somebody with a degree and mass in public communications, oftentimes when I see this kind of tension in communities, I find that the solution has to do with creating better communication infrastructure. And that's something that the council can actually do. That's something the council member can do. Because a lot of times, as Ellen was just expressing, like the very clearly very genuine frustration with the level of misrepresentation that's been going on, and then I've heard from people on the other side who perceive themselves as being misrepresented and so forth. And frankly, everyone could be right. And that's what's so frustrating about it, is that there's all these communication failures happening. And like Joyce was just saying, if we could create, if the council member could create more unified forums where multiple stakeholders are represented at the same time, rather than having all these competing meetings and people not showing up and so forth, you'll get everyone a bit more on the same page about just the basic facts. Because when people aren't agreeing on the basic facts, there's no way to solve a problem. And that's something that we've seen, especially in the federal government. When you look at the level of disinformation that happened over the past, few years, a lot of the fights between American citizens wasn't just about their ideologies, that people weren't agreeing on very basic facts. So I think that creating better communication infrastructure is something that council members should take a lead on, because that's a basic part of the community job, is ensuring that people feel heard. And if people don't feel heard, we got to figure out where those failures are happening and work ourselves to fix it, because it shouldn't be on responsibility of every resident who already has a busy life to be able to keep track of 30,000 meetings.
Right. So how about one more question, Ellen?
One more question. So the affordable housing on Roosevelt Island, the last of the Mitchell-Lama developments is about to come out of the program. Given that Roosevelt Island is fully developed, what can you realistically do to preserve affordability, especially in light of the state and city relationship and the Roosevelt Island political structure?
That is a very good and complicated question. I would say that there's a few elements. One, there's certain levels of designations of the number of buildings that are marked as of units that are required to be affordable. So we can change the affordability of existing units in terms of the number that there are within buildings. Another thing we can do is pass better rent control, because oftentimes a unit will start out decently affordable and the price just goes up and up and up, and there's no ceiling on it. Because like you just said, the island is pretty much developed. So the idea that we're going to be able to create a bunch of brand new infrastructure, that's not going to solve the problem long term. We need to work on fixing the equity problems that already exist with the buildings that are already there. But it is going to be a fight, and it's going to take a number of community stakeholders, and it's going to require a certain degree of camaraderie, shall we say, with the state legislature. Because Roosevelt Island is unique in the way that it's structured, and sometimes the solutions to those sorts of problems on Roosevelt Island are not as straightforward as they are in my section of Manhattan, because of the difference in relationship of management. But it's going to be a years long process, and the solutions are not going to satisfy everybody, because, like you said, the usual stock political answer of building more housing isn't always going to be an option.
Right. So we have 3 Mitchell-Lama buildings that are going out. Well, actually 2 already went out of Mitchell-Lama. The last one is going out, and it's going private. And then we have 1 building that's rental, and 2 buildings that are rental, 3 buildings that are rental, and they're private. How do you tell private buildings that they have to make affordable housing?
You pass new laws, and it's a heavy lift, and that happens primarily at the state level. That being said, this is not as heavy as a lift as it would have been years ago, because newer legislators in the Democratic caucus are significantly more open to those types of laws. I've known some. There's at least one who's leading currently, who I've known since before he was elected, and these are issues that matter a lot, because a lot of the new legislators have personally experienced not being able to access affordable housing. So I think that we're going to see movement on that, not overnight, but significantly more than we've seen in past years, because of the incoming class at both state.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Anytime.
Certainly after coming off of a debate and sitting here with us for an hour, we certainly appreciate your time, and we wish you good luck. And I just want everybody to know that coming up next week on Monday night, we're going to be speaking with Billy Friedland, who's also a candidate for City Council. So everybody is welcome to join us. And I want to remind everybody that your vote is your voice. And we need your voice loud and clear on June 22nd. So keep that in mind. Make sure you're available on that date to do your good citizenship and go on out and vote. And thanks again, Chris, for being here. And we're going to, pass the torch. We're going to snuff out the torch, and we're going to light it up again next Monday night. So thanks for joining us, folks, and good evening.